Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar on the hierarchy capabilities of lease control. My name is Lucy Oborn. I'm the Lease Control Manager here at Maxwell Geoservices and very pleased to be presenting today's webinar. This webinar focuses predominantly on team efficiencies in a global context. We're going to be covering off explaining what the hierarchy is and its functionality. Then we're going to look at some case studies focusing on simplifying your views within the hierarchy, and then some efficiencies. And in particular, we're going to spend time on transitioning between different legislation because that seems to be a hot topic of late. We'll quickly run through now what the hierarchy is and where your outputs appear within lease control before going into the practical case studies. Of Lease Control's 5 modules, the hierarchy relates to both the leases and agreements modules, driving compliance requirements of both. Each of these modules have their own hierarchy. Both are accessible for editing from the settings menu, and then selecting configuration, and then the module of your choice. This will open up the relevant configuration screen. Noting your hierarchy will be on the left. These appear similar between the leases and agreements, as you can see, however you customize them independently. Right-clicking any of the objects within the hierarchy allows you to customize the object using the new, edit and delete functions. Lease type is the lowest level you can drill down to in the leases module and is therefore the primary driver for determining compliance requirements on a title. Locality is traditionally the region that issues the title and legislates the primary requirements, but this is your choice. This is part of the beauty of being able to customize these fields as you see fit. You now have a third option called grouping. These don't appear in your drop-down menus within the lease records. It's simply a tool for organising your records within the hierarchy. This is one of the features incorporated into the case studies. You'll also notice you can opt to change the order in which these objects appear in the hierarchy, customise the name as you see fit, and move it under a different object in the hierarchy if you need to. In the Agreements module, Agreements type is the lowest level you can drill down to, and this is therefore the primary driver for determining compliance requirements on an agreement record. Although the Agreements module doesn't use localities, you still have the option of grouping. Again, these don't appear in your drop-down menus within the Agreements records. It's simply a tool for organising your objects within the hierarchy. As in the Leases module, you can opt to change the order in which these objects appear in the hierarchy, customise the name as you see fit, and move it under a different object in the hierarchy as you may require. We're going to jump straight into some case studies using the functionalities we just ran through. Firstly, you have a high volume of, for example, agreement types. It's not always necessarily convenient to view them in one long list and try and find what you're looking for. You can therefore use groups to organise your view into something more convenient. This has been useful for clients that have extended the application of lease control to non-title management, such as share sale agreements, engagement of drillers and other consultants, and many more. You'll note you also have subgroups, and as mentioned earlier, you can rearrange and order the groups and agreement types to suit your needs. A lot of our clients manage land titles as well as mineral titles and oil and gas titles, all for different reasons. It can therefore be more manageable to group the lease types by their rights, particularly where the official names are very similar and may cause error. Incidentally, you will note in many cases the locality has been recorded against the lease type. This is optional, however, can assist when reviewing data, particularly for new staff who perhaps are not as familiar with your company's titles and operations as you are. Lastly, it's quite common to use lease control to manage various operational permitting and approvals. These can be handled in either the leases or agreements modules. Just have a look at the functions of each module to see how you feel it would best fit. Either way, you can put these under a single group to make them identifiable, and of course, configure them under groups based on their legislation if you would prefer. Don't forget, in both leases and agreements, you have fields to retain information on which government department manages these permits to help onboard new team members who may not have your level of familiarity. Moving on now to some critical efficiencies. When we get to transitioning between legislation, there's lots of options for how to handle it. So we'll cover the 3 most common scenarios that give rise to several management options. We can always provide further mentoring if you have other needs. The objects within the hierarchy have a parent and child relationship. When you configure an action or public holiday in a parent, it will automatically apply to the children. Importantly, you do have a filters in both actions and public holidays to exclude those exceptions to the rule, and I'm sure you've stumbled across these from time to time as much as I have. You can use this relationship to cut down on your configuration entries, particularly useful for public holidays, but also useful when a provision of legislation applies to all classes of titles, making it possible to manage these in a single location. Don't forget, of course, that you also have a useful copy feature when recording it in the parent doesn't suit your circumstances. There are many ways that titles can transition from one government policy to another, but I'm going to look at the 3 major changes, as I mentioned, and how you use the hierarchy to manage these. I'm also going to sneak in some data management options that I've found useful in the past. The first is like for like. This is very common. They keep their original ID. Most of the time, an entire lease type will convert to the same new lease type, and they will all change at the same time. This isn't always the case, but this is the case for what we refer to as like for like. You simply edit the name of the group if all lease types follow this pattern, or where not all existing titles follow the like for like rule, indicate the existing group is no longer current and edit the relevant lease types to move them to a new group, leaving behind those lease types that do not follow the like for like rule. This is very, very common. In the second scenario, where a title changes its ID, this is again really common where they didn't all convert to the same new lease type and therefore that precursor to the number changes. It's efficient to keep the original record intact. That way, when a new staff member stumbles across old paperwork and they look up that number, they can track what's going on. From a data management perspective, if the original data is still relevant, you can use the copy feature to create the new record without destroying the old one. Either way, you can link the lease records via the relationships and update the status of the original title. And if the original grant is still relevant, you can always add a new critical date field for the re-grant. Now that we've snuck in some data management back to the hierarchy, you can edit the lease type if you wish to clearly indicate that it's no longer current. Needless to say, these new lease records can be created on an as-needed basis, so you don't need to be concerned if the changes don't all happen at once. Sometimes it only happens when a title gets renewed or transferred or when you apply to transition. In the third scenario, although they retain their original ID, it may be that the new provisions don't apply concurrently across all titles. As mentioned earlier, perhaps it's only upon renewal or transfer or application to transition from one to another. Simply set up the new lease type. As before, you may wish to indicate that the original lease type is no longer current to avoid any errors. You do this by editing the description, as we saw earlier. Then when the new provisions apply, you simply change the lease type of each relevant record from one to the other. Nice and easy. We do always, of course, recommend that you record comments within that lease record so that people can track at what point it changed. And of course, you can create a new critical date field for when it changed if you would prefer to do that. All in all, these systems are quite straightforward once you begin to experiment, so please feel welcome to set up a duplicate database so that you can experiment to your heart's content before applying it to your live database. And that completes today's training. Thank you very much for your attendance. This one was nice and short. I'm going to give you a moment to enter any questions that you may have into your GoToMeeting sidebar, and then we'll go through these. While you're doing so, please be advised that the next lease control webinar will be on contacts, rights and responsibilities. This includes data requirements for the automated email alerts feature. We'll be touching on how these can be used to change actions where certain parties require additional lead time, additional actions, or perhaps some don't apply. And always, we would appreciate user feedback on our webinars to ensure we maintain a high standard of service and implementation. For such purpose, or should you have any queries or requests for additional training or mentoring, I welcome you to contact one of the Maxwell Geoservices Global offices. Okay, it doesn't look like we have any queries, so that concludes our webinar. Thank you for everyone's attendance. Have a lovely day and know that I look forward to speaking to you again at our next webinar, if not before.